What is the relationship of America's welfare state to Christmas time? Join Richard Ebeling and me in this week's Libertarian Angle as we examine that question. Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and welcome to this week's Libertarian Angle. I'm joined by my co-host, Richard Ebeling. Good to see you again, and a Merry Christmas to you, Richard.
It's good to see you. Merry Christmas. And of course, no, not long after that, a Happy New Year. And it's good to be with you, of course. You're my old and wonderful friend, as well as all of our viewers and listeners who are always kind enough to share a little bit of their time with us.
Yeah, thank you all for tuning in. Thank you for your great support of FFF. Y'all have gotten us through 36 years. It's quite amazing. 36 years of presenting this principled, uncompromising case for liberty. Y'all know that this is our methodology. It's been our methodology from the very beginning. We aim to raise people's vision to a higher level as to what we really need to achieve a genuinely free society. And this is our end of year fundraising time, as you all know. If you've already donated, thank you very much. It's a tremendous honor. We greatly appreciate you getting us through it, 36 years. And this is the time of year where we get receive most of the resources that get us through our coming year. Donations in 2026 are also a critical factor. But if you haven't yet donated and you're considering doing so, we would really greatly appreciate it, and we'd be very honored for your support.
I'll just reiterate just what Jacob said. Um, when I first met Jacob many, many years ago in Dallas, Texas, we became fast friends. We came to realize that we shared many of the same classical liberal and libertarian views in common. The belief in individual liberty, the sanctity of the person, the importance of private property and the free market order, the invaluable necessity for a limited constitutional government in which our civil liberties and our personal freedoms were secure and guaranteed, both from private individuals and the abusiveness of government. And when Jacob, as he was saying over 35 years ago, decided to set up the Future Freedom Foundation, he very kindly asked me to join him and to help in this endeavor. And all I can say is that over 3.5 decades, there is no organization that I know of or I have participated with or done any other activities with who is as principled, consistent, as uncompromising in the most valuable and trustworthy and desirable way in preserving the philosophy of freedom. We are celebrating this coming year the 250th anniversary of the American Declaration of Independence, and this coming July 4th. Those principles that our founding fathers fought for, advocated, and which became an idea and an ideal for the world, and which guided the American system for over a century afterwards, are the same principles and ideals that the Future of Freedom Foundation stands for and defends. And as Jacob was saying, of course, your generosity in the past would have prevented us from being able to do what we've done if not for that support. And if I can join Jacob in saying is that if you see the value of our message and the importance of it for the future of your own personal freedom, as well as the freedom for your children and grandchildren, the country, the world, then I would ask you, as he did, to think about if there's a few dollars that you could contribute, small or larger, of course, to help this work continuing in this coming year of 2026, which will be an anniversary year, both of the Declaration of Independence and in terms of economic freedom of Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, which was
Yeah.
published in March 1776, just a few months before the Declaration. And they represented together the case for personal freedom, political freedom, and economic liberty. And that is what the Future Freedom Foundation stands for and will uncompromisingly defend for as long as it's in existence with your support.
Well, thank you, Richard. As you know, one of the great things about the libertarian movement is the friends that one makes along the way. I mean, it's so fascinating how, at the very beginning when I started going to conferences and seminars and you'd encounter other people, it was so exciting to have things in common with people that you never talked to, that you'd never met before, like the common books of Austrian economics and things like that you've read, and that the person will have read. And so it's really been a labor of love. I mean, the thing is, you and I both love this philosophy, and we became friends back in the 1980s there in Dallas because we have this shared commitment to libertarianism, but also this shared commitment to this principled way to present this philosophy, because we both believe in this methodology, that this is the way that attracts people to what genuine freedom is all about. And I know, people tend to get discouraged. I've seen that over 36 years, and they say, "Oh, we're not getting anywhere. Things are getting worse." And clearly things have gotten worse year after year that we've been doing this. But we got to keep in mind that the results are not are within our control. What's in our control is our message, and then you just let the results take care of themselves. The world's in good hands, you know. I remember George Washington's famous quote that, the result, let us prepare to a standard that is very high and so forth, but the result is in the hands of God. And so we do the best we can, but we enjoy ourselves in the process. This doesn't have to be a depressing, grueling thing. How many people have we seen drop out of the libertarian movement over the decades because they got discouraged and despondent? And, to me, I just love what we do in this life. I can't even imagine ever retiring, because we're doing the right thing. We're fighting for freedom, and we're doing it with this principled message. And Richard, it's just been an honor to have done this with you and to continue doing it with you. And thank you for those nice words. All right, Richard. So this is Christmas week. So let's start out with a proposal, a modest proposal. We're asking people to support us, but how about we go a step further and just advocate for a law that just forces people to support the Future of Freedom Foundation? Well, I mean, look, I mean, how is that different from the welfare state? We would be converting everybody into good people. There's a lot of statists that don't want to support our work. They say, "Oh, I've never support that kind of principled message, and going to dismantle the welfare state and the IRS and the income tax and the national security state." And no, I can't support that. Well, we'll force them to and just pass law. You have to send $100 donation every American. I mean, we'd be rolling in the dough, Richard, and everybody would be good and caring, right? Well, I think if you put it in that way, I think most everyone could see the immorality of doing that. That people say we don't want to support the Future of Freedom Foundation. Okay, that's their right. That's what freedom's all about. The last thing we would ever want to do is force somebody to do this. We want it to be voluntary. And yet, Christmas time is a good time to revisit the whole welfare state way of life in the United States, because that's essentially what the welfare state is. It's forcing people through the coercive apparatus of the government, the federal government, to fund things that they may not want to fund voluntarily. And if they're going to fund it voluntarily, well, then obviously the law is superfluous. You don't need the law. If you take like Social Security, which is the crown jewel of America's welfare state, why shouldn't this be up to children 100% to decide how to support their parents? And many times their parents don't need support. They're very wealthy, independently of anything else. They just have acquired a lot of wealth. But in those cases where families really need support, parents or grandparents, why shouldn't this be 100% the choice of American children, just like it's a choice on whether to support the Future of Freedom Foundation? And I think the answer is, well, because you can't trust children. That they're just not trustworthy. But yet, isn't that a negation of freedom? I mean, as a Christian, I would say God vests people with this free will to make this decision. And it seems to me the welfare state is saying, well, God made a mistake because he should have realized that people can't be trusted with that kind of freedom. So we're going to construct a safety net that is going to correct God's mistake. And that way, nobody's going to be able to slip through the cracks because we've got a safety net down there with this massive socialist program. And that's what it is. It's a massive socialist program. In fact, the entire welfare state, farm subsidies, education grants, the whole welfare bureaucracy, Medicare, Medicaid, everything is founded on that principle of coercion, that we have to force people to be good and caring. And I think this is a really good time at Christmas time to ask, do we really want this kind of system? Do we want a system where the government says everybody has to give a Christmas present to their friends and family by law, so they can be considered good and caring? Well, I don't think we want that kind of system. Well, then why do we have this massive welfare state way of life that was never part of American life for the first 100 and some odd years? Americans would never have accepted this type of coercive apparatus. There was no welfare state. There was no Social Security. There was no Medicare, Medicaid, income tax, or IRS for more than 100 years, because our ancestors rejected that way of life that denigrates freedom, that denigrates God's gift of free will, that destroys the concept of let each individual make this decision on a voluntary basis. What do you think?
Well, I want to just reiterate what you are saying about the American tradition. Um, it's hard for many Americans to believe of a time and a situation in which the government did not take responsibility for health care, medical treatment, old age pensions, education, and so on. But that is not the founding principles upon which this country was first operating. I'll just use one example. I've mentioned it before. When the French social philosopher Alexis de Tocqueville came and spent an extended period of time in America in the 1830s, and then returned to France and wrote his famous book, Democracy in America, there is a chapter in volume two in which he talks about the voluntary associations of the United States. He says that nothing impressed him as much as the sense that when any American felt that there was a cause or a social problem or some philanthropic endeavor that should be taken seriously, he immediately made a call out to others. And whether it be small groups within a community or at the state level or even at the national level, at a time when communication and travel was much more limited and difficult than today, obviously, human beings, individuals would come together and form themselves and advance their cause both with their time, effort, and money at a time when obviously 1830s Americans had a much lower standard of living and discretionary income. But he said, whether it be science research, whether it be education, whether it be religious outreach, whether it should be charity work for those who are less well off, all of these endeavors were taken care of with the people spontaneously coming together through voluntary association, the institutions of what we now call civil society, non-governmental human associations, to solve these problems without the state and without subsidy and permission. That was the hallmark of America. When people fell upon hard times, they could have assistance, but it was through the voluntary associations. Now, many were church-based, many church-based charity hospitals, other places to give people shelter, help them get some training to be on their feet financially. But all of this was done voluntarily without the state. Education basically operated that way. Mandatory government education did not really come in until the second half of the 19th century, and only slowly in one state and then another state, and then in the 20th century, the federal government being involved. But before that, education was considered a matter of individual choice, family concerns, or philanthropy. To give one example outside of the United States, between 1790 and 1830, it is estimated that approximately two-thirds of the British population was made literate before mandatory schooling. This was for charitable schools, church-based educational institutions, sometimes profit institutions, private tutors meeting with individuals or groups of individuals. Two-thirds to three-quarters of the entire British population was made literate over a period that is the matching years of the Industrial Revolution, when wages were low, work was longer hours than today, and people had fewer leisure times. But there was a sense of education and reading and knowledge, and all done through the private sector without the hand of the government. That's how America operated, and a freer country at that time of Great Britain, from which we took many of our freedom ideas, for those of you who know the history of the founding of our country. But it did not involve the state. The state was viewed as a hindrance, a barrier, a handicap, a burdensome source that took our wealth and limited our freedom if it went beyond the narrow bounds defined by the founding fathers, by the principles of the Declaration of Independence, and the institutions laid out in the Constitution. That is the meaning of freedom in America. Personal freedom, social freedom, freedom of association, for either in the marketplace or outside of the marketplace. But that is what makes a free, prosperous, and great society, not the heavy hand of government that makes us indifferent and callous towards others. Let me give one example. A few years ago, the German news magazine Der Spiegel, it's their version of like what used to be Time and Newsweek magazine, did a poll of some German businessmen. And the question was, did they feel obligated personally as a corporate leader of undertaking philanthropic or charitable work, either through their business or in their private life? The vast majority of these German businessmen said, no, that's not my responsibility. I pay my taxes. You see that abrogation of any sense of self-responsibility to others, one's community, even one's relatives. Well, I paid my taxes. That's the government's job. Does that not dehumanize us in a most fundamental and important way, just as a person living with others in a community and in a society? That is not the freedom way. That is not the good way. That's not the virtuous way. That's not the just way. The just way is liberty, freedom, conscience, and association with others based upon how you see what needs to be done and how you, in agreement with others, think it might be pursued. Not the heavy hand of government using your tax dollars without your consent and straitjacketing you and me and everyone else into their notion of how to do it, when to do it, for whom to do it, with no opportunity to break out of that mold of the planned society.
Yeah, it was interesting when you were talking about 1830s America and de Tocqueville, because what occurred to me as you were saying that is that you said that they had a lower standard of living. And there's no question about that, especially compared to today. Um, but what the thing about status is that they never ask what is it that causes higher standards of living. They just see this giant pool of wealth and they say the government needs to seize money from people who have it, the billionaires, the millionaires, and give it to the poor. They never ask how it is that that great big pool of wealth came into existence. And so why were people in 1830, why did they have a lower standard of living than people today? And Adam Smith really was the key to this, who you also mentioned, that the American people throughout the 1800s, whether wittingly or unwittingly, really discovered the cure for poverty. They discovered that if you leave people free to accumulate wealth, you don't force them to share their money, you don't regulate their economic activities, all of a sudden savings are coming into existence. That those savings are going into productive capital. They're making people more productive. A farm worker using a tractor is going to produce more than if he's using a hoe. And so it gradually starts building up till you get to the late 1800s, 1890 to 1910, which is my favorite period of time. Certainly no libertarian panacea. There were some bad things happening, no question. But all of a sudden, you have an enormous outburst of standard of living at that point. In other words, what was building through 1830, 40, 50, 60 finally bursts asunder in the late 1800s where there really was an increase in the standard of living. Real wages were doubling like in a 20-year period of time. They had sound money. They had gold and silver coins as the official money. They no welfare state, no income tax, no IRS. And they were also producing what de Tocqueville was talking about, this giant voluntary charity system. I mean, John D. Rockefeller, who's reviled by statists and public schools and so forth as a robber baron, he gave away $500 million. And that's in gold coins back then. This is how the hospitals got built, the museums, the opera houses, the libraries, all voluntarily. And it just boggles the mind that if we had stayed on that trajectory, along with free trade, because that's another aspect of how you increase standards of living among people, it boggles the mind as to where we would be today. I don't think there'd be any poverty at all in the United States if we had followed that trajectory. But we didn't. We abandoned that. Later generations abandoned that idea in this siren song of socialism, the welfare state, forcing people to be good and caring. And fortunately, the productive capability that had been built up has been surpassing the amount of confiscations they do. So it looks like their welfare state's the cause of higher standards of living. It's the exact opposite. We would have had a hundredfold increase in our standard of living, much even better than it is today, had we not changed the trajectory.
Yeah, your point about what creates wealth rather than just trying to redistribute what wealth there might be at a moment in time. I'll just make the observation that around 200 years ago in 1820, demographers estimate that the world population was approximately 1 billion. And out of that 1 billion people over the entire planet, they also estimate, they and economic historians, from best you can from the records, estimate that between 85 to 90% of the world lived in abject poverty. That is, barely getting by or not knowing where your next meal is coming from for you and your family, with just a handful of those in political power and some of the religious orders living off what others produce in the modest ways that their exclusive privilege would seem abject poverty to us today. Now, how is it that we escape from that? Escape from that in such a way that today, instead of 1 billion people in the world, there are over 8 billion, an eightfold increase in the number of mouths to feed on this planet. Yet again, the demographers and the economic historians and the official international organizations, including the UN, estimate that out of this 8 billion people, less than 9% any longer live in abject poverty. Now, you often see it clustered tragically in places like Africa, some parts of Asia or South America. But this has now become increasingly the exception to the rule rather than the rule. How did the world escape from poverty that had been the plague of humanity since all of history, both before and after recorded history? How did this happen over the last 200 years? Let's even say 250 years, the middle of the 1700s, let's say. There's only one answer for that: the escape from tyranny, the loosening of government controls, the freeing of the spirit and the latitude and liberty of the individual to apply himself and his mind and his creativity in free and voluntary association, in peaceful competition, in the pursuit of improving each and every one of their lives. That is what gave us this prosperity, freedom and prosperity, liberty and rising standards of well-being. That is the secret to this, which, as you were saying, Jacob, what is the full title of Adam Smith's book? On the nature of the of the on the nature and causes of the wealth of nations. What is it mean? What does it mean to be wealthy versus poor? And what makes you unable to escape from poverty to wealth? And it's the freedom of the marketplace and the freedom of the individual to live peacefully in his own way, guided by his own vision, ambitions, meanings, values, purposes, and in only voluntary rather than coercive relationships with others. That is the key to both freedom and prosperity, and the means by which people can have the wealth that enables them to have the ability and the calling, if they're in a free environment, to show the charity and philanthropy of which Christmas giving is just one example.
Yeah, see, that point that you're making is so profound because it's so obvious if you look historically, like at the United States, and there's other examples of where a free market system produces wealth, that's all that any country in the world would have to do. To If you look at really poor countries like Mexico, okay, relatively high standard of living, but tremendous poverty overall. Same with Guatemala, Venezuela, Colombia. I mean, look at Venezuela. That they have oil. out the gazoo. Mexico has oil out the gazoo, and they thought, well, if we just nationalize oil, the country would be wealthy. Well, they nationalize oil, and the country gets poor. Um, if they just understood that it's not natural resources, that you could have a country on a rock with no natural resources and that establish this kind of system that you and I are talking about. No income tax, no IRS, no welfare state, no social security, no welfare, none of this stuff, no educational system by the state, no national security state, like Hong Kong was. I mean, you could have a tremendously prosperous nation. Why can't they figure that out? It boggles the mind. Now, I think that what we really need is a restoration of faith in freedom. And the classic example of this is Social Security, is that I have no doubts that if you abolish Social Security today, everybody'd be fine. That children, what it would be an immediate pay raise because children don't have those taxes being taken out to fund this program. That's a lot of money right there to help families. For children that say, I'm not going to help my parents and grandparents, which I think is going to be a very small minority. That's what church groups are for. That's what foundations are for. I have no doubts that everything would be fine. There's also, but that requires a faith in freedom. But you mentioned healthcare, Medicare and Medicaid. We've become so accustomed to this, so dependent on this system that people just now argue over what the reform should be. Should we adopt a health savings reform or should we repeal Obamacare? And hardly anyone thinks about the fact that prior to Medicare and Medicaid, which are socialist programs, we had the finest healthcare system in history. It was absolutely incredible. In the 50s, I grew up in Laredo, Texas, I think, which was the poorest city per capita income in the United States. Doctors' offices were filled with poor people. Hard, I would say most of them couldn't pay. They would bring in tamales or something to compensate the doctor. The doctors never turned away anyone. They treated everybody voluntarily. That's what genuine charity is all about. Notwithstanding that, the doctors were the second wealthiest people in the town, second only to the oil people. And we're making money from people who could pay. And that's your ideal system. Along come Medicare and Medicaid. That's where the whole healthcare crisis starts. That's where healthcare costs start soaring. You got a massive artificial demand from the government. You got fraud involved. You got doctors retiring early. They hate what they do. So there's only one real medicine for this: get rid of all government involvement. But because people are so dependent on this system now psychologically, they say, oh no, we couldn't do this, Jacob. There'd be chaos. There wouldn't be chaos. There'd be harmony and healthy people as a result of free market principles.
Let me sort of build on that a little bit. There's a concept that economists talk about called price discrimination. The word discrimination often has a bad connotation, but in this case, it's the policy that a seller, quote, discriminates between different characteristics or categories of his customers. One form of this, before government health care, before government regulation of medical treatment and care, was private doctors. They would charge higher fees to their wealthier patients. And what would they do this for? Because they then could cross-subsidize their other patients who were less financially well off. The family that brings in a child because of some medical problem, a fever, a cough, something sometimes more serious, and they don't have a lot of money. Well, they basically use some of the fees that they would charge at a higher rate to their wealthier patients to basically cover the cost of basic subsidizing or giving away the health care for their poorer patients. That was a common practice. The famous Russian novelist, Anton Chekhov, was a medical doctor. And you can read how he lived in rural Russia in the 19th century. And he had some merchants and wealthier landowners in his rural area in Russia, and he would charge them a fee. Now, the local peasants, right? Poverty in rural Russia in the middle of the 19th century. I mean, what do these people have? He would just give them care for free because of the higher fees for those better off in the rural Russia of that time. Or they would give them a chicken, right? They're a farmer. They pay in a chicken, right? So you have yeah, that's your meal, right? Now, maybe some of the older, cracking some of the older viewers and listeners will remember a television show from the 1960s starring the famous actor Robert Young called Marcus Welby, MD. And it was about a medical doctor in a community who had his office out of his house. And who was his assistant? This young doctor who rode around on a motorcycle, who was the actor James Brolin, the husband of Barbara Streisand nowadays. Okay. Now, he price discriminated. If you watch those old episodes, he price discriminated. He did house calls. People came to his house at any time of the day, day or night, if they needed treatment. What doctor does this anymore? Why? Because regulations and controls prevent it. Doctors are prohibited by government law from price discriminating. If they wanted to give a cheaper charge to those who are less well off and charge their wealthier patients more to cross subsidize the less well off, they are legally prohibited from doing that. And who the hell makes a house call anymore? That's undone. I remember as a young boy, I was sick, and the doctor came and checked me out just for a high fever and said, I'll stop by tomorrow too to see how you're doing. That's how this was done. That is impossible today. It's like a fairyland of the personal care and the personal touch and the voluntarism of medical services in the way I've just described. That has been wiped off the American scene because of government regulation, control, taxing, redistributing, and planning. It has been a disaster, and it has taken out of the human element of medical care, as that old show with Robert Young, Marcus Welby, MD, highlighted and emphasized.
Yeah, another example of this is the dental business that some years ago, my dentist, who's now retired, but he told me that, of course, there's no Medicare or Medicaid for dental work. And so he and other dentists got together and on a rotating basis, one day a week, like on a Thursday, the entire day would be devoted to giving dental services for free to poor people. And it was all voluntary. And I have a nephew who's a dentist now here in Dallas, and he says that a lot of times poor people will come in to him or his partner, and they treat them. They don't sit there and block them and say, "Oh, well, this person doesn't have any money." They just treat them. They do it out of a sense of moral obligation. Well, to me, Richard, that's the only charity that's worth the word charity. When government is forcing doctors to care for poor people, or you're taking money from one group of people by force and giving it to another group of people, that's not charity. And who is the good person in that process? The IRS agent, the member of Congress, the voters, the taxpayers. I would say none of the above. The only charity worth the real meaning of the word charity is when it's voluntary.
And I should emphasize another point is that where is the greatest amount of medical crisis? I mean, in long waits to see a medical doctor, whether it be something just ordinary or a serious illness and needed treatment, a scarcity of physicians. In those countries in which the government has taken over healthcare, look at Great Britain with their National Health Service. It is a disaster. Doctors go on strike. The waiting lines are forever. It's typical of a socialist system. The government regulates the prices. The government dictates the treatment and how medical care is given. And all you have is that image of long lines with shoddy quality, poor service, and human indifference. And that's because the government has gotten in the way of the patient and the doctor. And what is the real relationship of meaning the doctor and the patient? The free association of the marketplace and the actions that emerge out of that to improve medical care, the quality of medical care, and the personal touch of medical care in the way I just explained.
Okay, on that insightful note, we'll wrap things up. Richard, as always, I greatly enjoyed the conversations. In fact, I've greatly enjoyed doing Libertarian Angle another year with you. Look forward to doing it again next year. Thank you again for tuning in. Thanks for your great support. Again, if you haven't yet made an end of year donation, I hope you'll keep us going and this program going into 2026 by making a generous donation to FFF.
I'd
Richard,
just like to wish everyone, myself, a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. And I'll just say again, that your support makes these ideas of liberty possible for Jacob and me and the others who work with the foundation possible in both the videos as well as our online and print publications that hold up a banner of liberty high in the principled way that the founding fathers meant as they first publicly articulated in that Declaration of Independence now 250 years ago.
Thank you, Richard. Merry Christmas to everyone and Happy New Year.